Florida's role in the Revolutionary War is often forgotten. In 1776, East Florida and West Florida were the only two southern colonies that remained loyal to King George III. That year, American forces launched an invasion into Florida to try to take the oldest settlement in the U.S., St. Augustine. 1 year later, the southernmost conflict took place in present-day Jacksonville. These are just some of the stories explored in an upcoming book, The Florida Campaign. And we are joined now by one of the authors, Kartik Krishnaiyer, to learn more. Kartik, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So when we think of the American Revolution, we think of cities like Boston and Philadelphia, but St. Augustine was a critical location for the British war effort. Explain.
So St. Augustine was the capital of the British colony of East Florida. And once the rebellion started in 1775, the British started stockpiling lots of weaponry in St. Augustine, weaponry that potentially could be used against the American colonial forces in the South, and also naval stores. It was an important port, even though the port of St. Augustine is a little tough to navigate. That's a whole other story, and I think people in Florida now know that in this era, which is why Jacksonville's become the more important port. But from a naval standpoint, from a military store standpoint, and also from the standpoint of the fact that East Florida had remained loyal to the Crown, because the population of East Florida and their experiences were significantly different than the colonies to the north of us.
So that means that then St. Augustine was a critical area, I assume, to attack by the Americans.
Absolutely. So there are three different efforts between 1776 and 1778 for the for the Continental Army, which George Washington was the commander-in-chief of, to attack and take St. Augustine. So in 1776, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia approved war plans for an American invasion, and they put General Charles Lee in charge of this, and he becomes a sort of famous or infamous figure later, in 1776, before the Battle of Trenton, when he got detached from Washington's forces and he gets captured by the British. But before that, he had been sent south to Georgia to lead an invasion of Florida. And Lee dithered because he realized that the time wasn't right, the circumstances weren't right. The British had had a force that was ready to meet the invaders right at the border. Right, the St. Mary's River, which is the border between Georgia and Florida today, was the border between Georgia and Florida then. So it was the border between Patriot Georgia, which had become part of the United States when the U.S. declared independence, and British East Florida, which had remained loyal. So that invasion never took place. Lee eventually gets recalled to the north, as I mentioned. He was present in New Jersey when he was captured by the British. And another general, Robert Howe, who's no relationship to the Howe brothers, who were British commanders. This is an American commander, was put in charge of the invasion, but there were some skirmishes along the border, but that invasion was abandoned. But a year later, Howe, augmented by the Georgia militia, invaded Florida. And they got as deep as Thomas Creek, which is in northern Duval County. In fact, it's about 2 miles north of Jacksonville International Airport today, and there's a marker and there's a battle site there. And that was the deepest the Americans got. Their plan was to come up through that area, cross the St. Johns River, and capture St. Augustine. They're met by British troops at that point. The British had after that first invasion had failed, the British had retreated back to St. Augustine. So then they met the invading American force there at Thomas Creek, and they defeated them. And then there was a third invasion attempt a year later. So the Continental Army keeps trying. Washington is convinced this whole time, we have to capture St. Augustine because of its strategic importance. We have to capture St. Augustine because the British have all of these, all this ammunition stored. And basically, the third attempt is rebuffed also at a place called Alligator Creek Bridge, which is in modern-day Callahan, Nassau County, and that was the last actual invasion. Now, Washington continued to want to invade East Florida, but the Continental Congress in Philadelphia said, no more, we're not funding this anymore. The political support for future invasions of Florida, or East Florida, I should say, died out at that point.
We mentioned the western part of Florida, Pensacola, at that point being the capital of that colony. What happened there?
Yeah, so different course of events. 1779, Spain enters the war, and Spain, aligned with the United States, begins to liberate West Florida. And at that point, the colony of West Florida went all the way west to the Mississippi River. So Baton Rouge was the furthest west point in West Florida. So they liberate Baton Rouge. They liberate, or liberate is a subjective term. They conquer Baton Rouge. They called it liberate because it had once been Spanish,
Sure.
right? They liberate Mobile, but Pensacola is the big prize. Pensacola is the big city. It's the capital. So the British kind of just retreat and they make a defense at Pensacola. And that becomes a 2-month siege that the Spanish finally break the siege with the Spanish Navy, one of the few defeats for the Royal Navy in that period of time. They basically had a lucky strike, hit the Fort George, where the British troops were stationed, and they were able to take the city in May of 1781.
What is the significance when we say the southernmost battle of the Revolutionary War was this Battle of Thomas Creek? Was it a significant battle?
It was more of a skirmish, I would say. I wouldn't call it a significant battle. The more significant battle was the battle a year later that I mentioned at Alligator Creek Bridge, which is roughly in the same area, right? I mean, we can split hairs, but one was in, Thomas Creek was in northern Duval County, what is now northern Duval County, Alligator Creek Bridge, southern Nassau County, so, kind of near each other. That was an actual major engagement with the Georgia militia, augmented by 4 American Continental units. And then on the British side, you had the East Florida Rangers, which had been and we might talk about them a little bit more later, which had been a loyalist regiment that had propped up in the period between 1776 and 1778, 4 divisions of them in addition to British regulars. So that was a major engagement at Alligator Creek Bridge.
So I want to turn to, at the time, Southwest Florida was home to mostly indigenous tribes, I assume, Calusa, Seminole. Can you talk to me about the role that Native Americans played in the Revolutionary War?
Yeah, massive role. Here in Florida, they aligned with the British and were a big part of, I just mentioned the East Florida Rangers. A big part of the East Florida Rangers was getting indigenous people, native peoples, to fight on behalf of the British and then be integrated in what was this quasi-militia, right? It was, you had some British regulars as commanders, but the East Florida Rangers, like the Queens Rangers who fought in Virginia and points further north, were this kind of mixture of militia, indigenous people, runaway slaves, and they fought very effectively. So in 1775, immediately after the conflict begins, the British realize they need to cultivate the Seminole. They need to keep them on their side, because if the Seminole are either neutral or side with the Patriots, then that's basically having an enemy within. So the British, who typically, historically, had not wanted to give the sorts of goods like rum and meat and potatoes and gifts to native tribes, were very generous. They invited them to a summit on a boat in the St. Johns River, and they gave them all of these things with just one obligation in mind. You stay loyal to us, you fight on our side against the Patriots. And they did. So they were very important in East Florida, in West Florida, the Creeks and the Cherokee and the Choctaws were all fighting on the British side. So there were very few Native allies, at least in this part of the country, that the American Patriots were able to cultivate. Now, I think further north, there were still most of the natives fought on the British side, but there were some tribes that fought on the American side.
So those battles were all in essentially what we call North Florida today. Okay. You mentioned slaves. Slaves also played a role, correct, for the British, primarily? Yeah.
So enslaved people were responsible for rebuilding the fortifications around St. Augustine, shoring up the Castillo de San Marcos, which was actually called Fort St. Mark by the British in that period. So they played a role doing that. And then there were runaway slaves, lots of them that came from Virginia and the Carolinas, that were given their freedom once they came to Florida if they enlisted in the British military. So the condition for your freedom was, we're going to arm you, you're going to enlist, you're going to fight. And they ended up making up a good number of the East Florida Rangers. And this was really disturbing for a lot of Southern colonists, right? Because you did not want to see armed African Americans. And in fact, you had plantation owners in Florida with enslaved people, and you couldn't distinguish sometimes between their slaves and the free African Americans who had been armed by the British and were effectively British regulars at that point, or at least part of the militia.
Kartik, we so appreciate you sharing your story with us, and we look forward to the book.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. We've got more great content for you, from news to the arts to the environment. So be sure to like and subscribe to WGCU's YouTube channel and follow us on our social media platforms for the stories that matter to you.